The 9-to-5 workday feels natural, so natural that most people never question it. It is treated as a basic fact of adult life, like gravity or time itself. You wake up in the morning, you work until the evening, and you organize the rest of your existence around those hours. Over time, this routine stops feeling imposed and starts feeling inevitable, but routines do not appear on their own. They are built. Before the modern workday, time did not move in blocks. For centuries, work followed daylight, seasons, and necessity. Farmers worked when there was light. Artisans worked until the task was finished. Rest and labor blended into life rather than being separated by a clock. There was no universal start time, no standardized end, and no shared rhythm across entire populations. That changed when work stopped being personal and became collective. The moment large numbers of people had to work in the same place at the same time, coordination became more important than comfort. Factories did not care about individual energy, creativity, or balance. They cared about output. Machines had to run continuously. Workers had to arrive together. Time had to be measured, enforced, and synchronized. This is where normal began to shift. The clock moved from a tool to an authority. Hours stopped describing time and started commanding it. Being early became virtuous. Being late became a failure. Productivity was no longer judged by results alone, but by presence. You were paid not just for what you produced, but for when you were there. Over time, this structure hardened into expectation. Children were trained for it before they ever entered the workforce. School schedules mirrored work schedules. Bells taught obedience to time. Sitting for fixed hours taught endurance. The idea was simple. Normalize the rhythm early so it never feels strange later. By adulthood, the structure no longer feels imposed. It feels like life. The phrase full-time work began to replace work itself. Anything outside that frame became secondary. Personal time was redefined as what remains after labor. Energy was rationed around working hours. Even identity began to revolve around schedules. People no longer asked what they did. They asked where and when they worked. What makes the 9-to-5 system powerful is not force. It is familiarity. Most people do not defend it because they love it. They defend it because it is all they know. It provides predictability in exchange for control, stability in exchange for time. Over decades, the structure embedded itself into housing, transportation, media schedules, and social life. Entire cities began to breathe according to work hours. By the time alternatives appeared, the system already felt permanent. Today, technology has changed how work is done, but not when it is expected to happen. Laptops replaced machines, emails replaced whistles, but the hours remained. The structure survived even after the original reasons faded, because structures that organize society rarely disappear. They adapt. And once something becomes routine, it stops looking like a design choice. It starts looking like reality itself. This is how the 9-to-5 workday became normal, not because it was natural, but because it was repeated, reinforced, and quietly accepted long enough to feel inevitable. The 9-to-5 workday did not emerge from science, balance, or human biology. It emerged from industry. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, industrial economies were expanding rapidly. Factories needed structure. Machines were expensive, and idle time meant loss. Owners needed workers present at predictable hours, in large numbers, under constant supervision. Time had to be standardized, not negotiated. Before this period, long working hours were common, often stretching from sunrise to sunset. 12 to 16 hours of labor was not unusual. Fatigue was expected, injury was accepted. Efficiency came from endurance, not design. But as labor movements grew and unrest became costly, industries were forced to compromise. The 8-hour workday was not introduced as a humanitarian breakthrough. It was a management solution. The idea was simple. Divide the day into 3 equal parts. 8 hours for work, 8 hours for rest, 8 hours for personal life. On paper, this sounded balanced. In reality, it created a clean, measurable block of labor that could be repeated every day, across every worker, with minimal variation. It made planning easier. It made control easier. Henry Ford is often credited with popularizing the 5-day, 40-hour workweek. But this was not generosity. It was optimization. Ford realized that rested workers were more productive, more predictable, and more likely to consume the products they made. Shorter hours increased output, reduced turnover, and stabilized the workforce. Efficiency improved. Profits rose. The model spread. Governments soon formalized what industries had already normalized. Labor laws defined full-time work. Over time, rules reinforced the standard rather than challenging it. Anything beyond 8 hours became an exception, which made the 8-hour day the default. Once written into law, the structure gained legitimacy. It was no longer a business practice, it was policy. This is where flexibility quietly disappeared. The clock did not ask what kind of work you did. It did not care about creativity, focus, or energy. It measured everyone the same way. Time became the currency of labor, replacing outcomes with hours. If you were present, you were productive. If you were absent, you were not. This logic traveled far beyond factories. Office jobs adopted the same structure. even when machines were no longer involved. Administrative work, creative work, and cognitive labor were all placed inside the same time frame. The schedule survived because it simplified management. Measuring time is easier than measuring value. By the mid-20th century, the 9-to-5 workday was no longer seen as an industrial artifact. It was seen as social order. Banks, schools, transportation, and media aligned themselves around it. Entire societies synchronized their daily lives to match working hours. Once everything depends on the same schedule, leaving it becomes difficult. The origin of the 9-to-5 workday is not mysterious. It is practical. It was designed to make large systems function smoothly, even if individuals did not. Over time, what began as a compromise hardened into a standard, and the standard turned into expectation. The system did not ask whether it still made sense. It did not need to. It had already been accepted. Once the 9-to-5 workday was established, its most important function was no longer production. It was conditioning. Working fixed hours did more than organize labor. It trained behavior. It taught people how to relate to time, authority, and themselves. Over years of repetition, the schedule reshaped daily life, not just work life. Waking up early became discipline. Staying alert for 8 continuous hours became virtue. Exhaustion became normal. The system rewarded compliance, not efficiency. If you finished your work early, you stayed. If you were productive in fewer hours, the extra time was not returned to you. It was absorbed by the structure. Over time, people learned an unspoken rule. Value is measured by presence, not by outcome. Being busy mattered more than being effective. This quietly altered motivation. People stopped asking how to work better and started asking how to endure longer. Focus was fragmented into hours. Creativity was forced into schedules. Energy peaks and natural rhythms were ignored. The body adapted because it had to. The mind followed. Outside of work, life reorganized itself around the same pattern. Commutes expanded, cities grew outward, rush hours formed. Even leisure became scheduled, compressed into evenings and weekends. Rest was no longer a state, it was a limited resource. The workday also redefined authority. Time became something you requested, not owned. You asked for days off. You justified lateness. Absence required explanation. The right to your own hours slowly shifted away from the individual and toward institutions. This transfer was not dramatic. It was administrative. And because it was administrative, it felt reasonable. Over generations, the structure stopped being questioned because it was reinforced everywhere. Schools prepared students for it. Employers expected it. Social life adjusted to it. Those who could not fit into it were labeled unproductive, unreliable, or unmotivated. The system did not need to punish deviation. It only needed to reward alignment. What makes the 9-to-5 system effective is not that it is strict, but that it is consistent. When everyone follows the same rhythm, resistance feels isolating. Alternatives feel risky. Stability becomes more valuable than autonomy. By the time people sense something is wrong, they usually blame themselves, not the structure. They feel tired, distracted, or unfulfilled, and assume the problem is personal. The system remains invisible because it presents itself as normal life. And anything that looks like normal life rarely feels like control. Today, the original reasons for the 9-to-5 workday are fading. Many jobs no longer require physical presence. Machines do not need supervision. Information moves instantly. Productivity can happen anywhere, at any time. Yet the structure remains. Remote work still mirrors office hours. Digital tools track availability. Status indicators replace attendance sheets. The clock is no longer on the wall, but it still watches. Technology did not remove the system. It made it more precise. The workday survived because it was never only about work. It was about predictability. Systems depend on predictability. Markets, transportation, education, and services all rely on synchronized behavior. When people move, rest, and work at roughly the same times, large systems remain stable. Changing that rhythm would require redesigning more than jobs. It would require redesigning society. So the structure persists, even when it no longer fits. What changed is perception. The 9-to-5 workday is now described as tradition, culture, or professionalism. These words give it emotional weight. They discourage questioning. They frame compliance as maturity and resistance as irresponsibility. The system no longer needs explanation. It has history on its side. For many, the workday defines identity more than work itself. People introduce themselves by what they do within those hours. Time outside of work is treated as secondary, even though it contains most of life. The balance promised by the 8-hour model never fully arrived, because rest and personal time were never protected in the same way work was. What remains is a structure that feels permanent, even though it was designed. The 9-to-5 workday is not a law of nature. It is not inevitable. It is a framework that solved a specific problem at a specific moment in history. It endured because it organized complexity efficiently, not because it optimized human life. Understanding this does not require rebellion. It requires awareness. When something feels normal for long enough, it stops being visible. The design disappears behind routine, and the most effective systems are the ones you no longer notice shaping your days. This is not about rejecting work. It is about recognizing structure, because once you see how something was built, you begin to understand why it still controls so much of your time.